The 16th of April, 1945. The sun rose over the East China Sea like a pale wound, light spilling across the waves that surrounded Okinawa. Out on radar picket Station 1, 25 miles north of the island, the destroyer USS Laffey rode the slow morning swells, her gray hull cut through the quiet water, her crew already at general quarters. The sea was calm, but every man aboard could feel its tension that comes before something vast and violent. Inside the Combat Information Center, the radar scope glowed faint green. Faint blips appeared, then multiplied. Enemy aircraft inbound. The Japanese were launching another Kamikaze wave, hundreds of planes rising from Kyushu, many of them kamikazes. The air outside was still cool, but the gunners were sweating as they loaded ammunition belts and checked sights. Metal clinked against metal. Engines hummed. In the distance, someone muttered, "They're coming." Lieutenant Commander Frederick Julian Beckton stood on the bridge, binoculars in hand, calm eyes sweeping the horizon. He was known for never losing his composure. Around him, signalmen worked silently, voices low, clipped. Below deck, steam pressure built in the boilers, the heartbeat of the ship. At 8:25 a.m., the first warning sounded through the corridors. Enemy aircraft approaching, multiple groups closing fast. The alarm echoed off steel walls. On the open deck, the men braced. A few seconds later, someone spotted them teeny black dots glinting in the morning haze. The Laffey began to turn slowly, angling her bow toward the threat. Her 5-inch guns elevated, hatches clanged shut, and the destroyer's vibration deepened as engines steadied her course. For a brief moment, the sea looked strangely peaceful, the sky bright and clear, until the hum of engines grew into a scream. At 8:30 a.m., the first plane appeared, a Naval dive bomber, low and fast, diving out of the eastern sky. The forward guns barked in reply, the shells bursting around it. The Japanese plane banked, pulled up sharply, and fell away trailing smoke. Another followed, then a third. The air erupted in thunder. Tracer fire streaked across the horizon, red lines against a pale sky. The deck shook under the recoil of the guns. The smell of cordite filled the air, sharp and heavy. Shell casings rolled across the steel grating, clattering at the men's boots. One of the enemy planes caught fire mid-air and plunged into the sea off the starboard bow, vanishing in a burst of spray. On the bridge, Beckton gave short, steady orders. "Keep firing. Do not let them close." His tone never wavered. Below, damage control crews stood ready with hoses and axes, their faces lit by the red glow of emergency lamps. The ship's entire body felt alive, breathing, fighting, resisting. Through the smoke, new shapes emerged farther out, more planes, more dots, spreading wide across the horizon. The radio crackled with distant warnings from other ships under attack. The destroyer rocked slightly as she adjusted speed, bringing every gun to bear. The men didn't need to be told what this meant. Kamikazes before, but never this many. By 8:40, the sound of engines filled the air from all sides. The horizon shimmered with motion. What had started as a few dots had become a storm. The men gripped their stations tighter. The sky was about to fall upon them. The 16th of April, 1945, 8:45 a.m., the first wave struck. The destroyer USS Laffey was an Allen M. Sumner-class ship, sleek, compact, and built for speed. She had already fought at Normandy, Leyte Gulf, and Iwo Jima. Her crew of 300 knew her like family. They called her the Lucky Laffey. But luck was not what kept her afloat. It was discipline, teamwork, and a stubborn will that refused to break. The first bomb exploded near her stern, sending a wall of spray over the afterdeck. The second hit closer, tearing open the port side near Mount 53. Steel plates buckled. The deck shuddered. Men were thrown from their positions. Flames climbed the gun tubs. The air turned black with smoke. Within minutes, the sky became a battlefield. Japanese Zeros, Vals, and Ki-43 Oscars dove from every direction. The Laffey's guns fired until their barrels glowed red. The 5-inch mounts thundered. The smaller 40mm and 20mm cannons filled the air with a solid wall of lead. Gunners tracked targets until the very last second, firing straight into faces they could almost see. One kamikaze came in from astern, engine screaming, wings level. The gunners on the aft mount struck it at the last moment. The plane cart wheeled across the sea, then exploded in a burst of flame that washed across the deck. Another dived from the port quarter, clipped the radar mast, and disintegrated. Fragments rained over the bridge. Inside the ship, damage control teams rushed through smoke-filled corridors. Water sprayed from ruptured pipes. Fires hissed and crackled. Men worked by touch and instinct, dragging hoses, sealing hatches, carrying the wounded toward the wardroom, now a triage center. The sound of gunfire outside never stopped. It came like waves, heavy and unending. On the bridge, Becton's voice cut through the noise. No one abandons ship. As long as one gun can fire, we fight. His words carried down the voice tubes, repeated in every compartment. No one doubted him. The ship was alive, and she meant to stay that way. Around 9 a.m., friendly aircraft appeared overhead. Marine corsairs diving into the melee. Their presence drew cheers from the gunners. The corsairs streaked across the sky, downing several attackers before circling again. But the relief was brief. More kamikazes pressed in, one after another. The Laffey took more hits. Bombs and burning debris rained onto her decks. Gun crews fought through smoke and flame. Every few seconds came another near miss, another explosion that shook her hull. The sea around her boiled with wreckage and oil. The horizon was nothing but fire and movement. For 80 minutes, the destroyer fought without pause. 32 of her men would not survive the day. 71 lay wounded. Yet by mid-morning, as the last Japanese plane spiraled into the ocean, the Laffey still floated, her guns still smoking, her flag still flying. She had been hit by bombs, struck by kamikazes, and nearly broken apart, but she refused to die. And before the day was over, the world would know her name. In the early hours of the 16th of April 1945, before the sky darkened with smoke, life aboard the USS Laffey followed a steady rhythm. The crew had grown used to constant tension. They were young men, most in their 20s, yet they had already lived through more battles than many would face in a lifetime. Each day began the same way. Stand to at dawn. Inspection of guns, coffee strong enough to taste like metal, and a moment of quiet before the first radar check. Below decks, the air smelled of oil and paint. The sound of machinery never stopped, a low pulse through the hull. In the mess room, men talked in fragments, jokes forced through fatigue. Some wrote quick letters home, words about weather and food that hid the fear they could not admit. Others cleaned rifles, folded shirts, or stood in line for breakfast that came in tin trays. Above them, the ship's loudspeakers hummed softly with static, waiting for orders that could come at any time. On the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Frederick Becton studied the sea. His destroyer had been assigned to radar picket duty, the most exposed job in the Okinawa invasion. 26 ships held those lonely stations spread across miles of open water. Each was a target, meant to draw the enemy's attention away from the landing fleet. Becton knew the odds. He also knew his crew trusted him, and that trust was the only armor heavier than steel. Morning light broke through thin clouds. A few sailors leaned on the rails, watching flying fish leap beside the bow. Someone remarked that it was almost beautiful. Another replied quietly, "Beautiful until they come." The silence that followed said more than any prayer. At 7 o'clock, radar contact came from Kyushu. Enemy aircraft had lifted off, hundreds of miles to the north. The men went about their routines with heavier movements. Ammunition belts were checked again. Fire hoses were uncoiled. Medical teams prepared morphine kits and bandages. It was all part of the ritual. They did not know when the attack would come, only that it would. The horizon stayed clear. The sea stretched endless, deceptively calm. The ship's engines drummed below, steady as a heartbeat. Somewhere, a machinist turned a wrench and whispered to himself, "Hold together, girl." The destroyer seemed to hear him. By mid-morning, the air had grown warm and still. The men at the guns squinted into the sunlight. The smell of coffee lingered, mixed with oil and salt. Then the radar officer's voice broke through the intercom. Multiple bogies inbound. 40 miles. Bearing northwest. Chairs scraped, boots hit metal, conversations ended mid-word. The routine dissolved. The day had changed. Every man knew it. Within minutes, the ship came alive. Alarms wailed. Deck hatches slammed shut. Gun mounts rotated toward the horizon. The calm that had carried them through the morning was gone. The sea around them seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere far above, faint specks appeared, moving fast. The gunners watched them grow larger, darker, until the shape of wings became clear. The storm was here. At 8:25 a.m., the shriek of the alarm cut through the ship like a blade. Enemy aircraft inbound. The the words repeated through the speakers until they blurred into the rhythm of gunfire. Every man sprinted to his station. Ammunition passed hand to hand. Gun barrels swung skyward. From the bridge, Becton's voice came through calm and sharp. All guns open fire when ready. His tone carried authority that steadied every man who heard it. The first dive bomber appeared out of the rising sun. It came low, its silver fuselage flashing as it rolled into an attack dive. The forward 5-inch gun fired first. The shell burst close to the plane, tearing off part of its wing. The bomber plunged into the sea, vanishing in an explosion of spray. Cheers erupted briefly, then stopped as new targets appeared. 2 more planes came from port, one high, one low. Tracer fire crisscrossed the sky, red and orange lines that burned into the morning light. The smell of gunpowder filled every breath. The ship's superstructure rattled with each shot. One of the attackers released a bomb that exploded close off the stern, lifting the destroyer's aft section clear of the water. Men fell, scrambled back to their guns, kept firing. The Japanese pilots came in waves, fast and determined. They dove through smoke, sometimes already aflame, aiming not for survival, but for impact. The Laffey's guns fired at point-blank range, so close that men could see the pilots' headbands before the planes disintegrated. One aircraft passed within yards of the bridge before smashing into the sea. Another skimmed the mast, clipping an antenna that shattered into fragments. Below decks, damage control teams worked by sound alone. The roar of explosions overhead told them when the next hit came. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes. Smoke crawled through corridors. Pumps wind. The wounded began to arrive at the makeshift aid station, some walking, others carried. Their faces were gray with shock, their uniforms blackened by fire. Corpsmen worked in silence, hands slick with sweat and blood. On the open deck, the gunners kept up their fire until barrels glowed red. They swapped positions without command, instinct guiding them. Ammunition handlers ran barefoot over hot steel, tossing shells up ladders. The destroyer moved in tight circles, engines straining, trying to make herself a harder target. For a brief moment, the attack seemed to falter. Smoke drifted across the sky like torn cloth. Pieces of wings and fuselage floated in the waves. The men dared to believe it was ending. Then the radio crackled again. More bogies incoming, bearing south, closing fast. The hope vanished as quickly as it had come. The second wave descended like hawks. Dive bombers screamed out of the sun, engines howling, each carrying a single bomb meant to die with its pilot. The Laffey turned sharply, guns roaring, the air filled with flame and falling metal. The ship trembled, but held her course. The crew fought as one body, one will, bound by duty and by the knowledge that no one else stood between the fleet and destruction. By 9:00 a.m., the sea around the Laffey burned. The smell of oil and salt mixed with smoke. Pieces of aircraft drifted by, still smoldering. Above it all, the American flag on her mast fluttered through the haze, torn but still flying. The attack had only begun. The worst was yet to come. By 9:05 a.m., the USS Laffey was surrounded. The horizon had vanished behind smoke and flame. The sea that had glistened pale blue at dawn now boiled black with oil and wreckage. Japanese aircraft filled the sky, coming in from every direction, north, west, east each, one diving with suicidal precision. There was no pattern to follow. No pause between waves, only the endless scream of engines and the rattle of guns that never stopped. From the bridge, Lieutenant Commander Becton watched a zero streak straight toward the ship. Port guns, fire. The order came too late for comfort, but not too late to matter. The forward batteries lit up the air. The Zero caught fire, veered left, and slammed into the sea so close that its fuel ignited the water. The blast rocked the destroyer, sending a blast of hot wind across the deck. The men did not flinch. Another target was already in their sights. A second plane came from high above, diving almost vertical. The gunners on Mount 52 tracked it until the last second. The bomber dropped its payload just before impact. The bomb hit the Laffey amidships, blowing open the deck plating near the port side. Shards of steel tore through the air like knives. Men fell screaming. The deck was suddenly slick with seawater and oil. A fireball climbed toward the sky. The ship's main deck was chaos. Flames rolled across paint and rope. Ammunition boxes burst in small explosions. Gunners fought on, half blinded by smoke. The 5-inch mounts continued to thunder. shaking the hull. The smaller 40mm crews kept sweeping arcs through the sky, firing so fast their barrels smoked white. The smell of burning gasoline clung to every breath. One kamikaze crashed into the aft section near the fantail, carving deep into the hull before detonating. The blast threw men overboard. For seconds, the stern vanished in smoke, then emerged again, twisted but still afloat. For seconds, the stern vanished in smoke, then emerged again, twisted but still afloat. Water poured in through ruptures, but the pumps kept working. Damage control crews sealed bulkheads, rigged hoses, carried the wounded down to the wardroom. Their boots splashed through firewater as they ran. On the bridge, Becton's voice came through the roar. "We will not abandon ship. Keep your guns firing." His command carried down the voice tubes, repeated in the chaos by men who barely had strength left to shout. "Keep your guns firing." At 9:10, the ship took another hit. A plane smashed into the base of the radar mast, tearing away the air search antenna. Metal rained over the deck. The mast itself stood bent and smoking. 2 men nearby were killed instantly. The rest kept loading ammunition. Flames now spread to the midsection. Paint peeled and curled under the heat. Crewmen formed lines with fire hoses, spraying seawater through broken valves. The deck hissed as the water turned to steam. Somewhere below, the generator room flickered, then failed for a moment before the backup kicked in. The lights dimmed but did not die. Every few seconds, another explosion sent vibrations through the hull. The ocean around the Laffey had become a graveyard of burning debris. Fragments of wings floated among drifting lifebelts. Overhead, Marine corsairs still fought, tracing wide arcs as they dove on new attackers. But there were too many. For each plane shot down, another replaced it. For 80 minutes, the sky seemed endless, filled with shapes that screamed and fell. And through it all, the destroyer fought back, every gun blazing, every man holding his post. The Laffey was bleeding, burning, but she was still alive. When one sailor paused to reload, he looked briefly toward the horizon and whispered, "If this ship sinks, she'll go down fighting." Then he turned back to his gun and fired again into the storm. By 9:20 a.m., the air was thick with smoke and ash. The heat on the deck was unbearable. Gunners fought shirtless, their skin blackened with soot. Shell casings rolled ankle-deep beneath their boots. The Laffey had already been hit by multiple bombs and several kamikazes, yet her silhouette still stood against the sky, defiant and alive. The port side was torn open. Flames crawled across twisted steel, devouring paint and rope. In the aft section, fire spread toward the ammunition magazine. If the flames reached it, the ship would explode from within. Damage control teams raced through the smoke, dragging hoses, carrying extinguishers, dousing burning decks with seawater. Their voices were hoarse, their faces streaked with grime. Every breath tasted of ash. The wounded were everywhere. Some lay in passageways, waiting for the medics who never stopped moving. Others were carried below to the wardroom, now a field hospital. The floor was slick with blood and water. Corpsmen knelt over shattered limbs and burned faces, wrapping bandages with trembling hands. The ship's doctor, his white coat turned gray, worked in silence, glancing up only when the hull shuddered under another hit. Above, Becton remained on the bridge, shouting orders through the noise. His uniform was singed, his face streaked with soot. "Get that fire out, keep the guns hot." His calm never cracked, even as another explosion tore through the aft section. Shrapnel slammed into the bridge windows, cracking the glass. He barely flinched. A new wave approached from the southwest. 4 planes flying low, skimming the surface. The 5-inch guns tracked them, firing continuously. One disintegrated midair. Another took a hit, burst into flame, and veered toward the ship. It struck just above the waterline, exploding into the engine compartment. The blast hurled men off their feet. The lights flickered again, and a thick cloud of black smoke poured out of the vents. The destroyer began to list slightly to port. Water rushed in through ruptured seams. Pumps clattered and groaned. The engine crew fought to stabilize power, their eyes stinging from smoke. Some worked by touch, using flashlights that barely pierced the darkness. They refused to stop. The ship had to move, or she would die. By 9:30, the Laffey's decks looked like a furnace. The smell of burned insulation mixed with sea salt. Gunners continued to fire with bandaged hands. They no longer counted the planes. They simply aimed and shot. The rhythm of survival guiding them. Each kill was a second bought, a breath borrowed. They simply aimed and shot, the rhythm of survival guiding them. Each kill was a second bought, a breath borrowed. By 9:40 a.m., the USS Laffey looked like a wounded creature surrounded by fire. Her decks were torn, her radar mast bent nearly in half, her aft guns half buried in smoke. The smell of burning fuel hung thick over the water. Yet through the haze, her guns still blazed. The destroyer refused to go down. The men at the aft mounts were running on instinct. They had been firing for nearly an hour, their ears ringing, their hands blistered. Shell after shell was passed down the ammunition chain, each one carried through corridors filled with smoke. Some men moved barefoot, their shoes melted by heat. They barely noticed the pain anymore. At 9:45, another group of Japanese planes approached low from the southeast. Marine corsairs screamed overhead, cutting through the sky to intercept. 2 attackers fell in flames, but one slipped through. It came fast, a silver Ki-43 Oscar with red suns on its wings, flying no more than 20 feet above the water. Plane coming in starboard. A lookout shouted. Every gun on that side turned toward the streaking shape. Tracers filled the air, but the Oscar held course. Its engine roared, its propeller a blur. The pilot's white headband flashed once in the sunlight as he aimed straight for the destroyer Bridge. The ship lurched as the helm turned hard to port. The pilot corrected, diving even lower. For a heartbeat, it seemed certain he would hit. The men on deck could see his face now, eyes fixed, mouth open in a shout they could not hear. Then, in a single second, the impossible happened. The Oscar missed. Its wingtip skimmed the ship's rigging, then clipped the antenna, sending fragments of metal scattering like sparks. The plane passed over the bridge by inches, its shadow washing across the deck. It plunged into the sea just yards away, vanishing beneath the waves. The explosion that followed was deafening. The blast lifted the Laffey clear of the water, showering her with flame and debris. A sheet of boiling seawater crashed over the deck. Men were hurled against railings, knocked from their stations. The heat seared exposed skin. For a moment, the world vanished in white fire. When the smoke cleared, the ship was still there, scarred, smoking, but afloat. The men staggered to their feet. Some were burned, others bleeding, but none abandoned their guns. A gunner looked out over the water where the plane had disappeared and whispered. He missed. The wave of relief was short-lived. Fires burned along the deck, licking at the base of the superstructure. Loose ammunition ignited in short bursts. The sound of secondary explosions rippled through the air. The deck was hot enough to burn through souls. Men ran with hoses, dragging them through the wreckage, spraying seawater that turned instantly to steam. Becton's voice came from the bridge, hoarse but steady. "Keep fighting. We're still here." His words were enough. The crew moved faster, feeding guns, cooling barrels, tending flames. Above them, the corsairs circled, keeping new attackers at bay. The Laffey, though battered, continued to move under her own power. Pumps fought flooding. The engine room reported partial control. The ship's list stabilized. Smoke from the explosion drifted off the stern, merging with the dark horizon. The mist strike had nearly ended her, yet it had also proven something more. The destroyer's strength was no longer in her steel, but in the will of the men who refused to let her die. The morning wore on, but time had lost its meaning. The ship was a world of smoke, heat, and noise. The air shimmered from the flames. The steel deck was hot enough to burn bare skin. Everywhere men moved through fire and wreckage, carrying hoses, ammunition, or stretchers. The smell of burning fuel mixed with blood and seawater. Below the main deck, the wardroom had become an emergency hospital. The wounded lay shoulder to shoulder, some groaning softly, others silent. Corpsmen worked in a haze of smoke and sweat. Morphine syringes glinted in the flickering light. Bandages ran out, so they tore strips from shirts and towels. Every few minutes, another explosion shook the room, showering dust from the ceiling. One man had lost both legs to shrapnel. Another, his face burned black, gripped a medic's hand and whispered, "Tell my mother I did my job." The medic nodded, knowing there would be no letter to send. He turned back to another wounded man before he could think. Up top, flames still licked the superstructure. The bridge was a blackened ruin. Gun mounts glowed dull red. Fires burned in the after section, threatening the magazine again. Damage control teams fought without pause. They crawled through smoke so thick it stung the eyes, dragging hoses over twisted steel. spraying water into holes that seemed to breathe fire. Some coughed blood, then kept working. By 10 a.m., the worst of the assault had passed, but the battle for survival had not. The ship's engines were barely holding. Her communication lines were shattered. Her radar was gone. The sea around her was filled with floating debris fragments, life jackets, fuel drums burning on the surface. A group of corsairs dove low overhead, tipping their wings as they passed. Their flight leader's voice crackled faintly through the radio. "Hang on, Laffey. You're still in this." The men who heard it smiled grimly. They didn't feel victorious. They felt alive. And that was enough. In the engine room, men stood waist-deep in water. Wrenches clutched tight. They patched pipes with scrap metal, rerouted power, and fed the turbines whatever fuel lines still worked. The deck plates burned their hands, but they refused to stop. Above them, the ship's whistle blew once short and sharp. It was the signal that she was still moving. On the stern, a sailor knelt beside a fallen comrade and closed his eyes with 2 fingers. He looked up at the twisted sky and whispered something no one else could hear. Around him, others dragged hoses, replaced ammunition, or carried the wounded toward the last working ladderway. The air was thick, heavy, and full of ghosts. When the fires finally began to die, the sea breeze carried the smell of burned metal and salt. The guns were silent now. Only the crackle of smoldering paint broke the quiet. The men stood amid the wreckage, blinking against the sting of smoke. Their ship had survived an attack that should have destroyed her. 32 were dead, 71 wounded, but the destroyer still floated, her flag still flying. In that silence, the survivors felt something deeper than pride. It was the understanding that they had looked death in the face and stayed standing. The Laffey had become more than a ship. She was a promise that courage could outlast even fire. By late morning, the 16th of April, 1945, the battle had ended, leaving only smoke drifting over the Pacific. The sea was littered with twisted fragments of planes, broken rafts, and pieces of scorched metal. Waves rolled over the bodies of fallen pilots, both American and Japanese, their silhouettes fading beneath the foam. The sky, once alive with movement, was now strangely empty. The USS Laffey floated at the center of that ruin, blackened from bow to stern. Her decks were gouged open. Her mast hung at an angle, bow to stern. Her decks were gouged open. Her mast hung at an angle. Flames still flickered in small pockets where fuel seeped from ruptured tanks. The destroyer looked finished, yet she still lived. Her flag hung torn but unbroken above the bridge, the colors blurred with smoke. Inside, the corridors were dark and hot. The air stank of smoke, fuel, and burned insulation. Damage control crews moved quietly, checking bulkheads and ceiling leaks. Pumps thudded below decks, fighting the seawater that poured through jagged holes. In the wardroom, the wounded lay in rows, tended by tired medics whose hands trembled from exhaustion. The sound of moaning mixed with the drip of water from overhead pipes. Lieutenant Commander Frederick Beckton stood on the bridge, surveying the destruction. His face was streaked with soot, his uniform torn at the shoulder. Yet his posture was straight, his eyes clear. Around him, officers took damage reports. Guns were gone, communications half dead, radar destroyed. Radar destroyed. The hull had been struck by 4 bombs and at least 5 kamikazes. But she was still afloat, still answering her helm. Cone called down to the engine room. The reply came faint but steady. "Engines holding. We can make 5 knots." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides both pride and grief. "Then we're going home," he said quietly. At noon, a tug and a rescue ship arrived. They found the Laffey trailing smoke, but still upright. The rescue crew stared in disbelief at the wrecked destroyer. One officer whispered, "How is she still here?" The answer was not in her steel, but in the men who refused to leave her. The survivors carried their dead to the deck, wrapping each in canvas. The wind was soft, the sky pale blue again, as if the ocean had forgotten the storm that morning. A sailor read from a small Bible, his voice hoarse but steady. When the last body was lowered into the sea, the men stood in silence. No words could measure what had happened. The ocean closed over the fallen, leaving only ripples that faded into stillness. Later, as the tow line tightened and the Laffey began her slow journey back to Okinawa, the men looked back at the black trail of smoke she left behind. It was proof she had survived. They had faced 22 enemy planes, destroyed 32, and endured the worst air assault ever launched against a single ship. Against every rule of war and chance, she had lived through it. That night, the destroyer rocked gently on the water. The fires were out. The sky was filled with stars again. The men on watch looked up and whispered to each other about what they had seen, about the sound of engines, about the faces of the pilots who never pulled away. They did not speak with hatred, only exhaustion. Both sides had given everything. Only the sea remained to remember. The Laffey's crew slept where they could on deck, beside ruined guns, near blackened hatches. The ocean whispered around them, carrying the smell of smoke and salt. They had survived, but they would never be the same. When the USS Laffey reached Okinawa days later, the damage astonished every crew that saw her. Her superstructure was half melted. Her decks were torn open. The gun barrels drooped from heat. Yet the destroyer still rode the water, stubborn and proud. Sailors from nearby ships called her the miracle ship. To those who had fought aboard her, she was something Mara home that had refused to let them die. Becton wrote his official report in calm language that belied the chaos he had survived. He listed the number of hits, the fires, the casualties, the damage to weapons and engines. But between the lines, one could sense something deeper, the quiet astonishment of a man who had witnessed courage beyond description. In his closing words, he wrote, "The ship's survival was due to the determination of her officers and men." That single sentence would become part of her legend. The Laffey was towed first to the anchorage at Kuramaretto, then back to the United States for repair. When she finally entered port, workers gathered on the docks in silence as they saw the scars along her hull. Some men touched the twisted metal as though it were sacred. The ship had become a symbol of endurance, proof that even in the face of annihilation, will could triumph over destruction. The newspapers called her the ship that would not die. Veterans told her story for decades afterward. Children who had never known war visited her in museums and stared at the holes in her deck, asking how a ship could take so much punishment and survive. The answer was always the same, because the men aboard refused to give up. Years later, when the Laffey was preserved as a museum ship at Patriots Point in South Carolina, survivors would walk her decks again. Some would stop beside the very gun mounts where their friends had fallen. Others would close their eyes and hear the echoes, the crack of flak bursts, the scream of engines, the shouts across the bridge. The paint was new, the air quiet, but the memories lived in the steel. Today, visitors step aboard and see the scars that were never fully repaired. They run their hands over the dents in the hull, the twisted rails, the burned deck plates. The ship breathes quietly, surrounded by calm water. She carries the silence of those who never returned and the strength of those who kept her alive. The USS Laffey remains the last surviving World War II destroyer to have faced such a storm. She stands not as a weapon of war, but as a witness to human endurance. On that morning in April 1945, when the horizon filled with smoke and the sky fell upon her, she proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it end you. And even now, as waves lap softly against her hull, the ship that would not die still keeps watch alive with the memory of the day the world tried to sink her and failed.